So I come from a different perspective. I'm going to try to approach this. I wish I would have met Dr. Frankel, but I'll try to speak to him through us all. And what I learned in my Hebrew school, and I think would have probably even radically transformed even Dr. Frankel's insights. I don't mean change it, but seen it in a light that goes back thousands of years. And so one thing we can pull rank over anyone on earth is we are both the founders of neurosis as well as the founders of its healing. There's no one neurotic as a Jew, right? And as well as, but we have an expression, Magdim Refuah Lamaka, that before the illness is preceded by the cure. So whatever challenge that comes our way, we already have a cure waiting to be released. And it's our job, whatever role we play in people's lives, in our own lives, whether it's professional therapists or psychologists or psychiatrists or mashpiyim or mentors or the words in the Torah, Selach Harav, appoint a mentor or a chaver, a friend. And the different terms used is to help discover that healing that's already there. Any good, humble doctor would always tell you the healing is already there. We just have to either ignite it or reveal it. No one is a healer. We bring healing, and that's why the Talmud says, Nitn Rishus, permission was given to the healer to heal, which itself is interesting. It means permission was needed. But only to be a healer, to be a channel for the healing that already exists in human nature and in the world in general. And especially when it comes to psychological matters, it's even more profound. So I will try to take this back to the beginning of it all. And I actually find it very relieving to know that there are professionals like yourselves and some of those that spoke here, because that needs to be covered simply from the perspective of on-the-ground methodologies and modalities and interventions that have been proven and that have a clinical and a professional scientific approach. But I believe just as that's important, we also have to have the other side of it, and that is the root of it all. And we both can inform each other, and that partnership is actually what God wanted in the first place. Because if that was not the case, He would not have given us the opportunity to be able to understand each other and help bring healing to the world. I remember years ago, I was running we were doing the Meaningful Life Center, we had a weekend camping retreat. And by me camping, I mean the real thing, the roughing part of it. Won't go into the details of that, but I remember, so we had a staff, very good staff, a professional staff, because people come, and when they're out of their own natural element and there's no human structure and it rains and anything else can happen, you have to have people who are ready to be somewhat impromptu therapists, actually, to help people manage this. So there was one woman who seemingly was really disturbed, and none of the staff were able to deal with her. She was making, everything was a problem. So finally, they said to me, that maybe you can speak to her. So I called her over and we sat down, and I saw that I wasn't going to get through to her. So I just said to her, look, we're here for the weekend. We're here for you in any way we could help you, anything you need. I just was being nice, but I realized I'm not going to get into any type of argument because whatever I would say was not going to be received very well. And that's what it was that Friday night. Anyway, next day, Shabbos by day, we had the davening and the prayer, and it was Shabbos Nachmu. So I gave a talk after the Torah reading, and I saw her there. She was there in the back, and I said the following. I said, there's a big question that's asked. Nachamu is, of course, the Haftorah that's read the Shabbos after Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, which in a way you can say personifies all trauma and all sadness and all mourning and all loss and everything we deal with. And of course, loneliness, as the beginning of the book of Lamentations, Eicha Yashva Bodad, the harshest thing of all that the prophet Jeremiah realized is what? That Bodad, she sits alone, loneliness. Not the destruction of the temple, of the holy temple, not the murders, not the exile, loneliness. That's how Tisha B'Av begins. And I said, but then afterwards God sends the angel to console us. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, a double consolation. But then there goes 7 weeks of consolation, which in itself, I've written a few tense articles about how you can look at the 3 weeks of the Tlosel Purnissa and the Shiva de Nechemta, the 3 weeks of affliction and the 7 weeks of consolation as really a healing process. 7 weeks, and each week it progresses the healing. And the Avodraham, one of the commentaries that explains these the series, the progression of these Haftarahs, points out that first God sends the prophet to console the people, and then the people come back and say, why are you sending the prophet? You destroyed the temple. Why don't you come yourself and console us? You don't send a messenger. You heard us. Now you come to apologize, so to speak, or console us. And finally, God says in the 3rd week, and yes, He Himself, God Himself, comes to console. So I asked the question, why is that the case? If God was anyway going to come to console them, He could have initially consoled them. Why did He have to send the prophet first? So here's the thought. The thought was that was the greatest gift God can console human beings. Obviously, created us, created our challenges, and can therefore console us. But that humans can console each other, that's a real novelty. Why? Because we're all mortals. And there's an expression, Ein chavish mater satzmei, a person who's themselves limited, how could they help another? So you would think we cannot help each other. And God gave us a gift. We can help each other. Even though we ourselves are subjective, and when we're in a situation, we probably have our blind spots, yet we can help each other. And that's the gift that was given to us. So that's the perspective I want to come from and talk about it. And as I said, some type of maybe a conversation with Dr. Frankel, share with him some insights from Torah, from where it all began. And it's obviously surprising to many, but once you see the text, you see it's not that surprising, that Jewish thinkers and Jewish scholars and Jews in general have been struggling with these issues from the beginning of time. It's not a new phenomenon in the 21st or 20th century, the concept of pain or suffering or psychotic or psychosis or any form of psychic issues, whether in mild form or extreme form. So it's always good to go back to the beginning and say, how was it dealt with? That's much less spoken about. So I want to say a few key points in that regard. They tell when Golda Meir became Prime Minister of Israel, so she received a telegram. Those days, you're all old enough to remember pre-email, there was a thing called telegrams. When mail would go by camels and donkeys and stuff like that, there was also a thing called a telegram. And so she received a telegram from Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State of the United States, Jewish, and he wrote to her, I welcome you into the diplomatic community, and I'd like to remind you, and this was his tactful way of telling her that she won't get any preferential treatment, though he's Jewish. He says, you have to remember, my first loyalty is a citizen of the United States. My second loyalty, I'm a Secretary of State. And my third and last loyalty is that I'm a Jew. She was a sharp woman, so she sent him back a quick telegram saying, I'm sure we'll have a great working relationship because you see in Hebrew, in Israel, we read from right to left. So, as it is also with Yiddish, of course. So when you're talking about science meets so-called faith, and with all the debates, this is not the time to go into the battle between the two. Science meets faith, and whether it's psychology or other sciences that meet religion, faith, often we see it as a clash. And the truth is we have to see it as simply reading from the right to left or left to right, and they can absolutely be not just reconciled, but each can enrich the other. So, of course, maybe the most important thing to state at the outset when you go to this topic, that we know there's symptomatic medicine and there's preventive medicine, or we'll call root medicine. You can deal with the symptoms, Band-Aids, aspirins, Tylenols, Advils, whatever it may be, or the equivalent in other areas. Or you can go and uproot the issue from the core. So you solve the problem from the outset, which of course is longer term, but also longer term work needed, but longer term also results. And obviously that's the thing we really would love to have, because then you really guarantee a bright future. And it's not about recurrence and so on and so forth. So they tell this is another taken from the Chelm stories, by the way, our excellent psychological insights. And I see a lot of us have been seeping into the world of the psychologists, because they're great, funny, and same time insightful Jewish insights into the human condition. So there's the big classic one, the classic joke where the guy's looking for his keys in the middle of the night. And he's looking, he can't find his keys. A neighbor comes by and says, let me help you look. Let's retrace the steps. Where'd you lose them? So he points like 100 yards away. 100 yards away is a pretty far away. He says, so why are you looking here? He says, because here is where the light is shining. So we always look for problems, especially our own, where the light is shining, not where the problem is, obviously where it's comfortable. Not where it's uncomfortable. Nobody likes discomfort. But when you get to the root of issues, you have no choice but to go sometimes to the uncomfortable. So, if we go really back to the beginning of it all, so I'll speak of somewhat of a, I guess you can call it a Kabbalistic, mystical, Hasidic take on the issues of dissonance and the roots of human, what shall we say, human anxiety. Is that a collective enough word? You get the idea. Where does it begin from? So remember, scientists and scholars, they have no choice but to go from everything from the bottom up. You study those that came before you. You study neurotic situations. You experiment, trial and error, and plenty of that has done plenty of damage too. But what other choice do we have? And slowly you try to develop some theory that works. It may not work perfectly, but it works in certain circumstances. And very possible the next generation comes and that theory is upset because not everything was taken into consideration. So that's called in the Jewish theology and thinking, mamata lamaila approach. You go from the bottom up and you use your empirical instruments, including observation, analysis, testing different things over a period of time under different circumstances and environments, and you try to develop a theory that works. That's what Dr. Frankl did. His theories actually were pre-Holocaust, and the Holocaust only confirmed many of his ideas. And the same was with prior to him, Freud and others. And I'm not getting now into what's right and wrong here. We're just talking about that. What other option is there? However, when you're coming from a Torah point of view, and I'm speaking here to a Torah audience, I'm not assuming that everybody accepts Torah as being absolute truth. Now, I'm not saying that in a sacrilegious way. I simply mean to say, just as a theory, if I was speaking to a secular audience, I'd say exactly the same thing. What is Torah? Besides the fact, a divine book, a divine blueprint, but it's also a collective story of the human condition that's the earliest documented challenges that the human beings dealt with. So if nothing else, you learn about the jealousies, the killings, the pettiness, all the stuff that, the Bible is the best lahavdil soap opera on earth that exists, because it has literally every scenario. Sibling rivalry, parents and children, sexual issues, you name it. Everything is there. Now, if you throw in the divine component, which I know that you all accept, it only adds something that we don't have to necessarily go only mamata from the bottom up. We can maybe look at things a little like a bird's eye view. Imagine you have a microscope into the soul, and you can actually see a soul, not just based on observation, but based on what we were told by the one who created the soul and by the one who created life. Now, I would never assume, as I said, whether we're speaking to a person of faith or a person of no faith, I wouldn't assume you just accept it by faith. It can be proven and shown, because again, if you're testing things anyway, why not test a theory that was given to us and said, this is what God says, what the soul looks like. Why don't you try it out? And if it works, it's as good, if not better, than any bottom-up type of observation. So that's what I'm going to try to address as well in this short while, and try to do justice to it. So I was looking where I could find a text. There are many texts, obviously, and I will cite many of them, but there was one text particularly, and it just happened to be Ashgacha Pratis, divine providence, that it was delivered by the Rebbe, the previous Chabad Rebbe, in 1931. So pretty much a Viktor Frankl contemporary. And it's a mystical text, obviously, a Hasidic text, but it touches upon points that I think are really fascinating, if not mind-blowing. And it talks exactly about how dissonance evolves. When you see a problem, and all of you see a problem, no problem begins from when you see it. There's something behind every problem. In most cases, people tell you there's a problem, it's probably not the problem at all. They're sharing with you how they experience the problem, or the things they want to focus on. So, of course, the best thing a trained eye can do is try to figure out what is the problem behind the scenes, like what is the cause behind the cause, so to speak. So here's how he puts it, but this is really taken from a lot of writings of the Arizal, the great mystic of the 16th century, and even from the Zohar, and all based on verses in the Bible, in the Torah, which I'll be referring to. So The first question, first human being was Adam and Eve, and they experienced the first ultimate, you can say, psychological dissonance when they ate from the tree of knowledge. Because up till that point, they weren't even aware that they were naked. Why? Because they were so seamlessly connected, like a child's innocence, they were not conscious of themselves. And we all know self-consciousness is the root of most problems, even though people think self-consciousness is like the root of also all awareness. But when you're not conscious of yourself like a child, that's actually a very innocent and pure environment. The problem is when you do become conscious and there's the I and the you, there's the subject and the object, there you have a duality. And how do we reconcile between the duality of the you and the I? And that's what happened to Adam and Eve. And you could see it in the story. What happens? After they eat from the tree of knowledge, suddenly they sense themselves, and they cover themselves because they were ashamed. And then you have that cryptic sentence, verse, where God comes to the garden and says, Ayeka. He's searching for Adam, where are you? So of course the obvious question, what do you mean, where are you? God couldn't see where he was. So this Rashi has answers in different commentaries. When the Balatanya, Reb Shneur Zalman of the Adi, was in prison, and the ministers saw they had a catch of a real scholar with them, so they came to interrogate him, and they were philosophers, many of them. So one of them asked him this question: what does it mean God is asking Adam, where are you? And he first gave him the commentary's interpretation, and the minister said, I know that interpretation, I want to hear your interpretation. So the story goes that the Alter Rebbe, who was a tall man, stood up and gazed him in the eyes and said to him, this is the eternal question that God asks every human being. You've lived 65 years of your life. Where are you? I don't recognize you. Sometimes you're sitting near someone and they space out and you ask them, where are you? Of course you know where they are. Their body's right there. But where's their consciousness? Where's their mind? Where's their heart? Are you with me? In relationships, you hear this all the time. I have a spouse, but are you with me? Not physically. We're talking about psychologically, emotionally, and so on. So God was saying, I don't recognize you. Where are you? Now what happened was this minister fainted because he was 65 years old. And, he didn't know what he was asking for. He says, you don't want Rashi's commentary, you want mine? I'll give you my commentary. In other words, so it's an unbelievable thought because the dissonance that took place. They say that an animal will not attack a human being because they see the Tzelem Elokim, the divine image, on the face of the human being. Then, of course, the question is, we see animals attacking humans all the time. And the answer is because they don't see the face, the divine face. It's been covered. Daniel, in the lion's den, his divine visage shined. So the lions didn't bother him. It's a natural thing. Animals will recognize the divine. What happened with Adam is, to put it in contemporary terms, it's like you ask somebody, who are you? They usually give you their business card. But that's not who you are. That's what you do. And what you do and who you are, you're most likely not aligned. And that, of course, is another root of so many issues in our lives, that what you do and who you are very much not consistent with one another. As a matter of fact, most people, the jobs they do, statistics show they don't even like their jobs. And even if you learn to like it, it's because, okay, you know what, you live with it, so you learn to adjust. And then there's a few rare specimens where people love what they do, and what they do is aligned with who they are. Now, of course, that gets to the question, who am I? Before we ask the question, if you're aligned, you need to know who you are. And all this is in one word, ayeka, in the precision of the Torah's approach to things, one word, ayeka, where are you? Now, if we could ask this to our clients and to people that come to us, bluntly, that would be great, but you can't always ask. It's too sensitive a question, and you have to take sometimes months and years of preparation just to get to that question. Now, that doesn't mean people have an answer, but if you think about it, it's a tremendous way of looking at the human condition, and yes, the duality, and ultimately the duplicity that it evolves in, which creates, who are you? I don't recognize you. You are one person. Last year, I remember before Rosh Hashanah, someone comes to one of my classes. She lives down in Israel. She's from France. So she sent me a little picture she found of herself when she was a little girl. And she grew up in a very traumatic and dysfunctional home. And she sent me this thing, broke my heart. She sends me the picture, and under the picture she writes, what happened to this little girl? And that captures a question that many of us have. What happened to us? You began one way, everything was so pure, so hopeful, dreams, aspirations, and something happened. Loss of innocence, whether it's overt abuse, whether it's passive abuse. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but something does happen. We all go through they'll call the Chet Eitz Hadas experience. It's not a one-time thing that happened back then. We all go through it. There's innocence, and innocence is lost. There's almost a sense of non-consciousness. There's just the seamlessness, as I said, of a child. And then we start becoming aware of ourselves, which has its virtues perhaps, but also has many drawbacks, because we all know that when we're in the moment, when you're in the zone, as they say, you're up at night and you're focused on something you love, and you don't even sense that time is passing, and you don't even sense that you're hungry, and suddenly you see it's the morning, those are the most magical and purest moments of our lives, because you were all together there. You're not second-guessing yourself. You're not trying to be somebody else. You are there. This is what we'd love to recreate. If we can offer this to people, come on, that's what we want. You want to have that ability to say, this is where I'm supposed to be. This is where I am. I'm happy with what I am. A simcha sachayim with the life you have. Of course, it's easier said than done, but at least we can cry over the fact that we don't have that. That's also awareness. The worst, of course, is when people feel that's perfectly fine. Everybody is screwed up, so what's the big thing, That's the sad. Baal Shem Tov says that there are two types of darkness. There's a darkness that you know it's dark, and you're waiting for the light, or you're searching for the light. And then there's aster panai, and that's the saddest one. The darkness is so dark, it conceals that it's dark. And you can convince yourself that that the bitterness is sweet, and day is night, night is day, and ugliness is beauty, etc., etc. So, going back, okay, so fine, this is a dissonance that you can imagine, if this evolves, it can get far worse. Adam and Eve at least had the sense, because they were so created, Yitzir Kapov Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, they had the divine sense to at least not just cover it up and say everything is great. They realized. And then, of course, they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, which is, again, cause and effect. It's not some punishment. It's because they no longer had the innocence of being able to be in a place like paradise. So they at least nipped it in the bud, so to speak. But the human race did not. Things only got worse. And from there on, you have the birth of what I call duality before. You can call it dissonance, whatever word you wish. And, of course, if it gets worse and worse, it ends up being what happens before the flood. A world that completely self-destructs. Because at the end of the day, even a subtle dissonance is going to turn into destruction. There's no way around it. If you don't stop it, it will turn into selfishness, and then into narcissism, and then into compulsive narcissism, and then into whatever, all the names you want to use. And you get yourself a situation that's no longer containable. It's become the human condition. The Christians actually call it original sin, and they say they can't even free themselves from it without the belief in some Jewish guy, which is another discussion. But we as Jews know that's not going to help believing in a Jewish guy, because we all have that same problem. You need something more than that. So in this discourse from 1931, which is called Im Ruach HaMeshim, what's the last name? Ruach HaMeshim, yeah. It's, if any of you want the actual source, I can give it to you afterwards where it's printed. He traces it back. Okay, fine. This is the dissonance of Adam. But it didn't begin with there. It didn't begin with Adam and Eve eating from the tree and losing their innocence. Something must have existed in them prior. Because if they had no temptation, if there was no serpent, or there was no what we call Yetzer Hara, or any other voice, then they would never have eaten from the tree of knowledge, which goes to the big paradoxical question that everyone asks. If they didn't taste from good and evil, how could they have done something evil? They hadn't tasted from it. The general answer to that is they may not have tasted it, but they knew of it. And the curiosity tempted them. And once you taste, you can't go back. It's not like you say, oh, I tasted, okay, you know what, let me spit it out and let's start again. It doesn't work that way. The question is, what was God's plan? What's the divine plan here? You set them up, you put them in a garden, you tell them there's two trees, one you eat from, the other you don't. It's very enticing. The tree of knowledge, good and evil. Wow. Like the serpent had all the great arguments. And you can't eat it. What do you think is going to happen? It's like telling somebody, don't open this book. Who doesn't open a book that says do not open? It's the best way to get somebody to open. It says do not open this, So it tempts them. In some midrashim, it even says Neira alil al bnei Adam, that God actually had like a conspiracy, set them up basically. Now, obviously, there are many good answers to answer that question, but the biggest and most important thing is to go back to what is the purpose of it all. And how did that evolve that we're capable of splitting into two, who we are and what we do, or however you want to define the dissonance of the human condition. So, using Kabbalistic terminology, but also from the Bible, what happens earlier? Where do we find a dissonance on a more cosmic level, not on the human level? You can say that the eating from the tree of knowledge is the first human experience of dissonance. But what about on a cosmic level? So you just have to go back a few days earlier. On the fourth day of creation, it says that the moon and the sun were created two great luminaries, Shnei Me'er Sagdelim. And then suddenly he says, Moira Gadol and Moira Kotan, the great luminary and a small luminary. So obviously what's going on here? Are they both great, or one is greater than the other? So the Talmud tells us the moon was jealous. The moon came to God and said, you can't have one king with two crowns. So God said, okay, if that's the case, you diminish yourself and the sun will become the king. Now this concept, this miyut halavana, what's called, the diminishment of the moon, is not a small matter in Jewish thought. It's a major one. That's what creates Rosh Chodesh, which we celebrate and bless every month. That was the beginning of the exodus from Egypt, HaChodesh Hazel Lachem. It's the symbol of Jewish life, that just as the point of extinction, the moon is reborn, Shehem Hasidin L'Schadesh Kamesei. And when you go into the deeper text, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands of pages written on this miyut halavana. You go into, for example, the writings of the Arizal I mentioned, or the Zohar. There's entire sections on what is the meaning of this diminishment of the moon. So to put it in simple English, think of it like the step before dissonance. A dissonance in existence itself, with the moon and the sun representing two archetypes, which I'll explain in a moment, and they cannot coexist. For the reasons being, because when we live in a world of egos clash. And when you're lacking what's called in this language bittul, a type of selflessness, a type of not taking yourself so seriously and you're the center of the universe, if you're lacking that, you are inviting all trouble. So the diminishment of the moon is not just some type of something about the celestial body diminishment. It's a diminishment in existence itself, and it's essentially recognizing, which, as the Kabbalists put it, that the sun and the moon represent essentially two forces in our lives. One is called the giver, and one is called the receiver. The moon, of course, reflects the sun's light, but it has its own personality. Sometimes it's compared to the masculine and the feminine. I specifically did not say man and woman, because when you talk about these topics, masculine and feminine are archetypes. There are many men that are more feminine, there are many women that are more masculine. But we're talking about two archetypes that definitely exist, and they need each other and they complement each other, because Adam and Eve, as I mentioned, were born created as one in the divine image, and then they were split. So they are, in a sense, like the sun and the moon. So the diminishment of the moon represents a diminishment that, on one hand, definitely demonstrates the ego of the moon, because it was like a punishment for complaining, but it also represents change and represents rebirth that the sun does not have. For example, you'll see two people who love each other staring at the moon. You'll never see them staring at the sun, even with sunglasses, because the moon has its own haunting power. Here's not the place to go into it, but let's put it this way. It's an earlier step in the evolution of dissonance that starts with miyut halavana. I'm going to get back to it, because all this can be translated, I believe, in a modality that's psychological, that can help us actually identify the roots of the dissonance or other issues of conflict that people are struggling with. So what precedes the diminishment of the moon? So here comes the second verse in the Bible, maybe the most cryptic of them all. After it says, Bereshit bara, beginning God created heaven and earth, then it says, Va'eretz haisa tohu v'vayu, v'cheshech al pnei hatahim, v'ruach elikim merachefes al pnei hamayim. So everybody knows this verse. It's number 2. It's Genesis 1:2. But does anyone know what it means? And you learn the Rashi, you can learn commentaries. It remains a very cryptic verse. First verse, God created heaven and earth. But then suddenly, what is tohu, vayu? And the darkness covered the entire existence. And the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. The whole thing is beginning to end is almost indecipherable. But when you look into the mystics, this is a mystical verse, to be honest. It's the only way to understand it. Because what was physically tohu v'vohu? What are you going to exactly describe? God created heaven and earth, or he didn't create heaven and earth. So where was there chaos? Tell you it was often chaos. Now, chaos is, of course, a word everybody knows what the word chaos is, a chaotic life. There you got yourself another psychological term. So in retracing the steps, the diminishment of the moon is preceded by yet an even more subtle form of separation, and that is what's called the Shvirat HaKelim, the shattering of the containers that you hear about in Kabbalistic terms. Now, this may sound somewhat above some people's heads. It's not at all, because I'm going to explain it in simple English shortly. But remember, shattering containers, if you think about it in simple terms, simply means a person who is overwhelmed by trauma. That can be called shattering of the containers. It means that your containers cannot contain, and you're overwhelmed by a condition. That can be trauma, that can be abuse, that can be all the other things that cause people to have a shattering. Now, it could be a shattering on a subtle level, it could be a shattering on a very extreme level. That always depends on what they experienced. So that's step 3, going back. I'm going to go back to it all again, so I'm not done. Don't think that I've said it all on this. And then comes the first of them all. Where is the root of the root? The mother of all dissonance, if you want to put it this way. The mother of all conflicts. So this is called the Tzimtzum Harishon. This is a doctrine actually called the Soid HaTzimtzum, the secret of the Tzimtzum, the doctrine of the Rabbi Isaac Luria, who revealed, or even they say innovated it based on Zohar and so on, that describes how can existence exist if God is omnipresent. So it begins with a theological and also a psychological dilemma, and that is this. Now I am assuming that one believes in God, okay? God creates the universe. We say, Ein Eid Milvadei, nothing but God exists. So why are we sitting here and completely unaware of that? To drive the point home even further, we know that we're all created by one force, and we're all like limbs in a larger organism. As the Yerushalmi says, is it conceivable that a right hand should hit the left hand? No, because it's one body. And we have these immune disorders, God forbid, where the body turns on itself is one of the most tragic things. So how is it indeed possible that human beings turn on each other? How can we hate each other? How can we dislike each other? How can we wage war with each other? All the injustices of history. Now, I know it's a klutz kasha, but from a point of view of faith, where's God? Like, well, how is it possible? The answer is because we don't sense the divine, and therefore we can sense ourselves as being what we call existential loneliness. Where did that originate from? And that's where the Arizal was struggling to figure out. The Kabbalists before him and the thinkers before him could not fully understand, explain at least, how can there be this type of disconnect, first of all, between man and God, and second of all, between man and meaning, and between man and man, meaning person and person. How is it possible? You have to, what theological model can explain this? And his answer in brief, this requires really a lot more than just a short, but I'll just say in brief, is that the same God that can create existence has the power to conceal his presence from existence. And that was a prerequisite necessary to allow for independent reality. How could we be independent individuals, thinking and feeling and acting with free will and so on, if God's omnipresence is completely all-consuming? Which is the language of the Arizal, that before this Tzimtzum, he says, the divine energy, the divine Ein Sof, Or Ein Sof, filled everything. Obviously, we mean conceptually. So Tzimtzum is how he explains it, and as I said, it needs a lot more to do justice, there's a lot more discussion, but suffice it to say, it is the divine creation that creates the first disconnect, and it's a necessity for us to be able to exist, or else existence cannot be as we see it, as we know it, without that Tzimtzum. So in essence, you can really say that any form of dissonance, and any form of neurosis, and any form of anxiety, or a sense where we feel lonely or whatever it may be, is really a divine creation. Absolutely, and you can blame God if you like. You know, the Jews take God to the Din Torah and then they go and daven mincha. That's how it works. So you can blame God, but you know, there's only one God. And the point here is not to blame. The point is, first of all, God's secure enough that you can find. That's why we pray, and that's why we challenge, and that's why Avram Avinu and Moses and Moshe Rabbeinu, they challenge God. But at the end of the day, there is one God. But what happens here, And I don't want to find the right words. I'm not trying to justify neurosis, but at the end of the day, if we didn't exist, we wouldn't have all our problems. Obviously, as God says to Job, when he says to him, why the wicked prosper? He says to him, were you there when I created it all? You ask me why there's suffering. Do you ask me why there's joy? You ask me why there's death. Do you ask me why there's birth? You ask me why there's pain? Do you ask me why there's good experiences? We don't ask that question because we take that as a given. We don't know the big plan, and I'm not suggesting that I can explain it, but we do know that our being here is not an accident. So in a certain way, and I just want to make sure to not say it the wrong way, not that human misery or human pain was inevitable. It's not. But the root of it was always possible. Because that's the necessity if you're going to give someone independence. Let's think about it simply from parents and children. Many of you have children and grandchildren, right? Who haven't felt the anxiety or the what's the word I want to use? Even fear. The first time your children go to school, or the first time when they get married and they go out there and they have to learn from their own mistakes. We'd love to be able to prevent them from learning the mistakes. But there's no way a child's going to learn to walk if you're going to hold a child all the time. So it's a necessity to allow the child to say, hey, walk on your own. I'm there for you. I'll pick you up. I'll catch you, whatever. But you have to cut the umbilical cord. So on one hand, you could say it's very sad. I wish I didn't have to. The same Alter Rebbe once said to his in-laws, because they had some money and he was impoverished when they got married. And they said, if you live here in our town, we'll support you. Then there was no wiring money. You had to live with your shver or shviger. Now, they were fine people. It wasn't a problem. And the Alter Rebbe responded humorously. He said, it's a very enticing offer. And I say, you can daven and you can write and you can learn and teach. We won't get involved in anything, but we'll support you. He said, it's a very enticing offer. But what's even more enticing is to go back into your mother's womb. There you don't even have to struggle for eating or drinking. No parnasa issues. Actually, you have the best yeshiva of all. The Malach himself comes and teaches you the entire Torah. After that, it's all downhill, as we know, no matter how good the yeshiva system is. So the Alter Rebbe says to his in-laws, he says, very enticing offer. It's even more comfortable to go back to the womb. But there's one small problem. The child has gotten too large, and the space has gotten too small. Now, in other words, built in to life is independence, and independence built into that is the possibility of a dissonance, not necessity. In Chumash it says, every day God said he saw the creation, Vayemer Elokim, Vayar Elokim ki tov, that it was good. Day 1 he created light, it was good. Day 3, day 4, except on day 2. Day 2 doesn't say ki tov. Why? Because on day 2 God created separation. Now separation is necessary for diversity. Separation is necessary for a structured universe. You can't have everything being the same thing. But you can't say tov yet because it's a possibility that diversity will turn into divisiveness. Day 3 comes, and we all know day 3 is shalom. Kasav Ashlishi, the third verse, that machriya, that reconciles. Day 3 shalom in Judaism is not just a peace, it means wholesomeness. And day 3 it says twice good. Good for day 2 and good for day 3. Because on day 2 we still don't know which direction it's going to go. Will diversity lead to beauty and growth, or will it lead to war? Machlekes. On day 3 we know, which is why 3 is such a central number in Judaism. Torah, Matan Torah, the month of Matan Torah, and so on. So the point I'm making here is this, that it all begins with the divine so-called concealment, allowing for an independent existence to be. Is that itself a crime? No. But it could end up causing a lot of problems, because once the God conceals himself, we all know what can happen next. Humans can determine that God's not here anymore. Since God's not here, I'm God. And if you know how the Rambam explains the evolution of idolatry, that's exactly what happened. They didn't start worshiping idols. They first said, you know what, God's too invisible. We need something as a symbol, etc., etc. So the point being is that it all begins with a dissonance on a very cosmic level, on a divine level. That in turn will turn into we'll call it a market correction, which is called the shattering of the containers, which in turn will become the diminishment of the moon, which in turn will cause the Chet Eitzadas, the possibility for the Chet Eitzadas, with the humans choosing the wrong choice. And then, of course, it goes from there, it can just get worse and worse, or better and better. Now, why is this so vital? You could say very nice, very interesting so-called anatomy of dissonance, etc. No, it's vital because you can retrace in any condition that you deal with, no matter what it is, whether it's traumatic situations or it's abuse situations or other issues people deal with, anxieties and so on, you can actually find these 4 steps in each person's life. You can find the choices they made that were bad, going from the bottom up. You can find the ego that got in the way somewhere that caused a diminishment of personality. You can find the shattering, something broke. It could be subtle. For example, if a child day after day comes home and the parents are not around, absentee, even if there's no overt abuse, what do you think happens after a while? The child stops waiting. They stop becoming disappointed. That's when the saddest day is. They start adjusting to an unnatural reality. They're adjusting to parents that are supposed to be there to love them and nurture them, and they're not there. I'm using that example. So something shatters. What shatters? Maybe a hope, a promise, a belief in yourself, self-confidence. If you think of it the other way around, when you have that nurturing, then there will not be a shattering because you prevent that by creating the nurturing environment that any soul and every human being needs to blossom, like a flower with water. What happens when a flower doesn't have water? It will wither, and there'll be a shvirat, a kalim. So it doesn't have to be seen. Shvira doesn't mean necessarily that the whole world there's an earthquake and tremors. It's a subtle psychological tremors that people go through. And then you get back to the root of all roots, and that's the concealment. That's the concealment. I have no doubt that if we take these ideas and we, what's our time here? Fine? Okay. If we take these ideas, and we address them to Dr. Frankl, I have no doubt he would come up with a brilliant way of translating them into the system that he uses. Because at the end of the day, the search of meaning is based on one key axiom, that we are meaningful people. Because if you go with we'll call it whether it's a Hobbesian or a Darwinian, Freudian model, who says there's meaning in the first place? Maybe it's all meaningless. It's one big accident. Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene, survival of the fittest. Why is meaning even a word? So it's all built on an axiom. The axiom is that human beings at the deepest part are searching for purpose, which means that there must be purpose and there must be design. Now, why are they searching for it? Why don't they have it? Because somewhere that meaning was concealed. There you go, the Tzimtzum. If you go pre-Tzimtzum consciousness, meaning is everywhere. It's the divine energy, the divine presence is there. As soon as there's concealment, then suddenly we're on our own, so to speak, at least in our consciousness. So then we start searching. We're starting to search, how did we get here? Why are we here? Why did this whole thing happen in the first place? Why did God create a Tzimtzum, if you want to put it in those terms? And then from there, if it devolves, what happens? That disconnect slowly turns into something that lack of meaning, which, let's go back to the words I said earlier, who you are and what you do are no longer aligned. So what do you think is happening? Who you are is a person whose desperately needs for your survival and for your own welfare meaning in life. What you do has nothing to do with meaning. You're making money, fine. You have a good job, you have influence, maybe you're successful. But does it have anything to do with the purpose of your life, or it just happens to be you're surviving in a material world and you're doing the best with what you have? So there you have the disconnect right there. How could that not create a shattering at some point? There will be a shattering. I mean, it's strange for me to cite this, but I was once invited to Cambridge to talk about, there was a conference, it was about affluence and spirituality. So the topic I was given was money and religion. It's an interesting, mix. Money and religion. So I did my research. I went back to do my, get back to Adam Smith and capitalism, and of course our good old Karl Marx and Marxism, etc., etc. So then I opened up my talk and I said, I want to quote something. I'd like you to tell me who said this. He says like this. The quote goes something like this: that when you're at work, you're not at home. When you're at work, you're alienated from who you really are because you're working for someone else. You're competing with co-workers for a promotion. You're not even necessarily even working on something that you're going to benefit from. So basically, when you're at work, your soul is not at home. And when you're at home, you're not at work. So there you have a split, a psychological split. So I asked, who said this? Now, seeing they think I was a rabbi, so they said, the Kotzker Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, I don't know, they came up with a whole bunch of different names. Anyway, I said, no, it's Karl Marx. Marx, not Groucho, but Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx, was a self-proclaimed atheist. And yet he uses the word soul because he was a brilliant man. As much as we may not like his ideas, but he was scathing critique of capitalism and a materialistic world. And what do you think so many Jews gravitated to him? Because his utopian vision was very attractive. However, it wasn't practical. It was not viable. But some of his critique is very interesting to learn from because it's absolutely true. The workforce that we have here in the United States, people working, the hours they work, if you had to independently sit down and analyze, what does that do for the human psyche? Is it good for us or not good for us? The conclusion would be. Now, we don't have the power or the ability, and we can't go fight the whole city hall and change the system. So we have to find, and that was my theme, was how do you find in work deeper meaning? How do you so-called spiritualize the material? Because Judaism is not about a monastic and ascetic lifestyle. It's about engaging the world and teaching and introducing transcendence into a material world. Fine. But work itself, what are you talking about? Look at how we're addicted and trapped to our contraptions, to our gadgets. I was sitting in a car with a friend. I haven't seen him for a while. I'm trying to communicate, I should say. He's texting, and I saw this is not going anywhere, so I decided to text him. So I text him, and he's sitting near me. He says, "Are you texting me?" He was had this suddenly he was disoriented. I said, "Yeah, because I can't get your attention." Do you understand? It tells the whole story. So we live in a world with all the progress. The dissonance is extremely profound between meaning and our lives, what you do and who you are. And therefore, Frankel's premises are absolutely based on these ideas that I shared earlier. It all begins with the premise, as I said, that there is meaning, and that in some way that meaning is hard to access. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be sitting here, we wouldn't have a conference on this, and Frankel wouldn't have anything to say. It's all based on not just that there is meaning, but that we're in search of meaning, because it's not easy to find. And even when you find it, how do you integrate it into your life when you're already running at 90 miles an hour and busy? So, if you're able to take and trace it back, and I'm saying this to Dr. Frankel, wherever he may be, his spirit is here? Huh? Okay. Is that if you, as a good Jew, would study with me and would study with us all the texts, I have no doubt we'd find deeper understanding in the search of meaning and also deeper interventions that we could actually use and find these models. Because they do go back thousands of years, and it's not my modern take on these verses. If you look at the text, they all talk about it. They talk about it in cryptic terms. It's a little more mystical, but it's all defines essentially the evolution of how dissonance enters into our lives. Take away dissonance, what we call the pre-chet tzadas consciousness. You have a perfect world. You have a world that's a messianic world. You have a world where what Adam and Eve did was one with who they were. What do you think their punishment was? People think it wasn't a punishment. It was cause and effect. You separated yourself from who you are, from your meaning. So what do you think happens? Adam was told, you now have to work for a living. You have to, at the sweat of your brow, birth, which should have come so naturally, would now be painful and difficult. Why? Because you introduced duality. Once you separate meaning, purpose, from who you are and what you do, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to create a world of two, at least duality, if not plurality, and all the fragmentation from there begins. Every business knows, the business 101 is you cannot have a business without a mission statement. It's, in other words, a meaning, a purpose. And a mission statement is short and unique. Google's mission statement, for example, to organize all the information in the world and make it accessible to all. I think Microsoft's mission is a computer in every home and every office. These are mission statements that sound deceptively simple, but they run 70, 80,000 employees, all work under that umbrella. When you ask a person, and I've asked this to many people, tell me, what's your personal mission statement? You know what everyone answers? Almost everyone. One of the few options here. They say to be happy. That's a big one. To make money, because then I can buy everything I need. To build a healthy family. Okay. Now, all these they're all great things, but they don't qualify as a mission statement. It would be equivalent of a company saying, our mission is to make money and to have happy employees. Every company is supposed to do that. The question is, how do you do it uniquely that's yours? It's your... And that's where people start saying, oh, you know what? That I'm going to have to develop. I have something to say, but it'll take a few weeks for me to share it with you. Or I have a few options. Or I'm waiting till I retire. That's when I'll discover my personal mission. Now, you tell me, if someone came to you for an investment in business and answered any of the above, what would you do? You would throw them out. You wouldn't even look at them. You don't even know what your mission is. You don't even know what's the function, what's the purpose of what you're doing every day. That's how sad it is, that we live in a world with 7 billion people, and most people never even ask this question. No one ever compelled them to ask this question. It's the first question that Hashem asks, Adam, Ayeka, where are you? I gave you a mission, La'avdel L'Shamra. I put you in a garden. I gave you everything you need to serve, to protect, to actualize, to realize the potential in this universe, potential in your soul. And you went off for some other agenda. So essentially, the search for meaning is the foundation of all of Judaism. Everything follows from there. Because if you don't have purpose, then what's the meaning of Torah and mitzvahs? Torah and mitzvahs is to fulfill that purpose. When the Rambam and others write that Mashiach is a ikar, is a foundation in Judaism, some ask why. I understand that 613 mitzvahs. Torah was given at Sinai, but why is believing in Mashiach such a fundamental? You know why? Because it's the realization of the purpose. It would be the equivalent of saying that the world was created with design, purpose, and meaning, but that meaning will never be realized. You might as well say that there's no purpose if you're going to say that. So there's a realization, there's a journey, it's going somewhere. So the foundations, without even question, of logotherapy are completely Jewish. Not just Jewish, it's Torah, it's everything I described earlier, and what's even more fascinating is that we have a model of how things can go wrong. And obviously, as I said, Magdim Refuah Maka, which is the healing preceding the illness, how we can make it go right. Both two ways, either to prevent that it shouldn't go wrong in the first place by keeping that focus, and number two, to do what we have to do to correct when things don't work out exactly. So I hope that I try to give that type of perspective, and the end of the day is that all problems will begin with a vacuum and the void of this dissonance that I described. And that's exactly what the Tzimtzum is. It's a void. It's a vacuum. The void of a person not having meaning. I'll conclude with this. I spoke for a group of teens at risk a while ago, and they were already on the rebound, going to rehab and getting their issues, getting their lives together, drug and alcohol, primarily. And I remember it was an informal group, and it was a very informal discussion. So I asked them all, there's no human being on earth that's going to say, I want to become an addict. Nobody wants to be controlled by something else. So how did you end up in trouble, You didn't set out and say, I want to become addicted to the point I'm out of control and now I need to go to rehab. No one wants that. So what was the root? What did it start from? So it was interesting to hear the reactions. One person said, my parents were going through a very ugly divorce, and I was just self-medicating to numb myself a bit. Another person said, I had bad friends, and this was like a high and excitement, and then suddenly it gets out of control, and it's too late. And we were talking, but I said, but I want to know, why is it that some people who may have, God forbid, ugly divorces, and they don't get themselves in that trouble? And other people who are bad friends, and they don't necessarily fall. What's behind it all? I was trying to push get to the, at least consciously, and one of them suddenly said, which is what I was waiting to hear, he said, I was bored. I was bored. Boredom sounds like very innocuous, so we're all bored at times. Who's not bored at some time? But boredom is, if you want Symptomatic, personified, embodied in a human being, is boredom. Nothing going on. It's quiet. You're lonely. It's monotonous. And you need some rush. You need some high. So if it comes from a good place, great. And if it doesn't, like the thirsty person and the only thing he's given to drink is something that's toxic, you're desperate. Boredom is not per se the crime, but it's the environment, the breeding ground of all infection. Like any infections don't come from nowhere. You create a breeding ground, and then things begin to emerge. And we started talking about it. Everybody in the room there, even those that didn't even sense it, said, yeah, absolutely. If I was given something to do that was motivating and exciting, it would have countered the problems that I was dealing with. I had these problems. I had nowhere to turn. So whatever came my way, that's the thing I grabbed. Now, it's not necessarily something I've said here that's revolutionary, but it's putting it into a context. So you have there at Tzimtzum a void of meaning, a void of purpose, is going to, not guaranteed, but is the most likely cause for most problems. I'm willing to say that without question. Now, of course, there are many other factors, and that alone cannot account for everything, but it's a tremendous point because and also give meaning and purpose and passion to someone, and the best preemptive medicine. Is it guaranteed? Of course not. We all can get into trouble, even the most purposeful people and the people with driven and so on. But if you're talking about preventive medicine, talking about like a helmet to protect you in those environments, it's that purpose and drive. So if you take Tzimtzum, which is the void, which will lead to Ashviras HaKelim, somewhere something's going to give, which will lead to a diminishment, which will ultimately lead to a loss of who I am, Ayaka, is the process that leads you from the void all the way to the worst, but also gives us the refuah, the healing of how we can reverse that and turn it into a productive and meaningful lives. And as Jews, I don't have to tell you, I mean, we have, unfortunately, in the frum world itself, there's also dissonance where people can be frum, but they don't at all see how that's psychologically connected. And they can be psychologically extremely dysfunctional and be the most frum Jews. That's another discussion, which we'll do at another time. Anyway, God should bless us all. We should have only healing in this world. There should be a time where we will not need any more refuah. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.